Hello everyone, welcome to day 2 of IRDC. So I'm going to talk about designing for the metagame. Now, the first question that often comes up with this is, what the fuck is the metagame? And in particular, what does that mean for roguelikes? So metagame as a concept means things that are outside the game itself. Knowledge that you're gaining or something that you're gaining. It particularly comes up in things like online role-playing games where you're doing some proper role-playing, but then you're using kind of meta knowledge about the game itself to change the way you role-play. For instance, that's one way in which metagame comes up. In roguelikes, it has an interesting meaning because roguelikes are particularly vulnerable to spoilers, as in you play the game and the way in which you advance in the game is actually your own knowledge in the game. They don't have the same kind of metagaming in other games whereby, for instance, you know a certain thing is coming up in the game, so you go after a specific item to help you with that due to external knowledge. Because of the procedural generation in roguelikes, they're not so vulnerable to that. But just looking at traditional roguelike setup is such that you have a number of specific game instances, but there is a wall between them. There is nothing carried over from one game to the next beyond your own specific knowledge and experience, your own abilities. That is the intention with roguelikes. They are mastery games, a bit like chess and Go and other games like that. They're all about you yourself getting better at the game, and not anything within the game changing because you've played it. However, there is a notion of metagaming whereby you have information somehow coming out of each particular run that you have, and this is having a sort of an accrual of meta content or meta information, and that somehow is then feeding back into future runs. So what you're doing in previous games is adding to this kind of cloud above the game run itself, and then is feeding into future runs of the game in some way. So there's two particular points to what the metagame is. The first question is, what does the game actually record in between individual runs? What information is being stored after death within the game? In the game's code, after you die, what information about that death and about that character still remains afterwards? And then the second is, what is the game doing with that information? How is it using that information? And there's lots of examples of this. And in fact, the original Rogue had a high score. That is a form of metagame information. And in particular, the original Rogue had a high score that was on a Unix terminal that people were sharing, so that you're actually competing for scores with other people. That is a metagame. That is not you just trying to do as good as you can within the game or enjoying this particular single-run game that you have. That is you trying to beat other people. So there's a kind of metagame to how you're competing with other players. That itself is a metagame. There's the idea of unlocks in a lot of games. In FTL, you unlock different chips through runs. So in your particular run that you have, you might unlock future abilities for future runs through the game. And again, that is the whole unlock system, the whole reaching for unlocks, achievements, all that sort of thing. That is a metagame. And then a big example is Rogue Legacy, whereby you're not really intended to win in a single game. It's actually all about what you build up over multiple games. You build up a family. You build up a point system that runs across multiple games. And some say that is completely anathema to roguelikes, that roguelikes are not meant to be like that at all. They're mastery games. They're about the single run. They're about just you and your personal knowledge and skills, not about what you're building up over multiple games. You shouldn't just be scumming your way to the top through multiple runs. So people say that's horrible and terrible and we should avoid this sort of thing altogether. I think there's a lot of interesting things we can do here, so I'd like to explore this further. And whether that blurs the lines between what is or is not a roguelike, I do not care. It's about what is interesting and what game mechanics are unexplored that we should actually be looking more into. Now, one important point is that sometimes we want to avoid the metagame. We want to avoid people thinking beyond the game run. We want them locked in and focused on that particular run. We want them immersed in the game that they're having. typically, you know, a big thing about roguelikes is trying to avoid spoilers. Spoilers are in a certain way a metagame themselves. We have wikis for pretty much every game out there. It's kind of inevitable that you get spoilers, but what you do not have for any roguelike really is a walkthrough. And, you know, most other games out there, most in particular RPGs, which roguelikes tend to sit within, they have step-by-step walkthroughs. Go through this, fight this battle, use these abilities in this battle, now pick up this item, go to this location. Roguelikes, you know, most roguelikes, that is just completely impossible. There are ways of having hints and tips at this section of the game and that section of the game, but roguelikes, to a large sense, are spoiler-free, or spoiler-immune in a certain way. In particular, they've got strict perma-consequence, so you can't just return to a save game and, with the knowledge that you gained from the death that you just had, take your actions differently and go through like a different branch of possibilities. No, you've got to start from the start again. And that changes greatly the ability for you to use metagame knowledge of, you know, this choice or that choice, right? There is no recorded data between games. So what you're doing isn't having an influence. It's not improving anything for your future characters. Everything's randomized. So you know, you're not expecting certain things at certain locations. Now, this isn't entirely true, because it isn't always randomized. ADOM, for instance, has a world map. And if you played ADOM a lot, you'll know the locations to visit. You're not exploring blindly. You build up that knowledge across games. Most roguelikes have particular bosses that you come across, either in fixed locations or in semi-random locations. And there are specific known strategies for approaching these bosses. And although the items and the enemies and the outcomes and things might be randomized, they're still often within a specific set, and there'll be specific strategies to these type of enemies, to discovering what certain items do, to how you use these items. So it's not impossible to completely oppose the metagame, but the more you impose these ideas, the more you separate yourself entirely from metagaming. So if, as a developer, you want people focused on that specific run of the game, you can do all these things. You can have more randomization, avoid fixed locations. You can have very strict perma-consequence, and you can make sure that no data gets recorded. And another thing to do is closed source. ADOM is the most well-known one in the community, a game that is closed source still after 20 or so years. Not all the secrets of the game are known. There is no full walkthrough because no one actually knows all the mechanics of the game. So it lends extra mystery to the game, which can be useful if that's the sort of thing you want. But, you know, we could go the other way and embrace the metagame entirely. And Rogue Legacy, in particular, makes metagaming not just possible, but makes it actually part of the game. It's essential to the identity of the game. The word legacy in there specifically means that you have a legacy from the games that you complete, that there are things carried over that you build up upon. And the game is equal parts what you do on that run with this layer of how you build your legacy. So when you die, although your character is dead, you choose an heir. And the heir that you have is based on the sort of things that you did during that run. If you exploited certain mechanics more, you might be stronger in those mechanics. And you actually kind of build up your family tree in this way, such that you get certain statistics and traits that you're going after. So you can breed future characters in a way based on the actions of past characters. In addition, you build up gold during the game, and the gold can be used by items and abilities. So you're building up a resource that can be specifically spent to make yourself more powerful during the game, during future runs. And there's also the ability to lock down levels, so that as you're advancing through the levels, they're all randomly generated. But if you see a level that you particularly like, that one section, you can choose to lock it down. So every future run gets exactly that one. So you know what to expect in that area, and you know how to take advantage of that. So it goes all out on the metagaming side. Now, there's various aspects to how we make use of the metagame. either to create an entirely different type of game like this, a legacy game, or to simply improve the way or be inventive with the way that we have our current games presented. So we have a lot of social aspects to the metagame. So ways in which people, whilst they're playing the game, they're still part of a larger community. And this could be a tremendously important way of making people feel like they're part of something bigger when playing the game. You know, one of the big things about games and other forms of sort of media consumption we have is that we like to feel part of a community. So high scores is the most obvious way of having that, and it's the oldest way of having that. When you get a score in a game and you can compare it directly with other scores that people have, then that adds an extra element to the gameplay that is beyond just what you're doing, and it can make you want to go back and play more and do better. And you can have that, you know, if the scores are uploaded online and people can see that, then you know, that can be a big thing to include in your game. Achievements and trophies, very similar effect. These are a type of metagame. There's something that you accrue across games. They may not have any effect in the game, but they can be a nice way of making the player feel like they're achieving something through multiple runs. And in particular in roguelikes, we have this problem that, you know, it can sometimes feel like you're just constantly bashing your head against a brick wall with nothing really happening. And the achievements are a way of showing that you're making a few cracks in that brick wall. Keep trying. So things like achievements and high scores are a way of helping people feel like they're making progress, even though they've played hundreds or thousands of times. You can have shared community files. So there's this idea in particular of bones files. NetHack, for instance, has these bones files whereby when you die, information about your character gets separated and stored, and you might actually come across a ghost of that character on a future run. It's pretty interesting from a gameplay point of view, but it's also interesting from a community point of view. If you're doing this on a community server, so that your ghost files get shared with everyone, then you're coming across other people's characters, and maybe potentially being killed by people you know. That's an exciting, it's a sort of community thing you can be doing. Some games have daily challenges. Now ADOM has a challenge of the week. Spelunky, I think, is a daily challenge that's very popular, and there are sort of slight variants of the games in terms of the mechanics and restrictions that are put on you. But you know that other people are playing under the same challenges and restrictions, so it can be a fun way of having a slight metagame element. It's outside of the normal game, and it's a way of people getting a bit more fun out of it. You can go beyond this. So Tales of Magial, for instance, it has a chat window within the game, and the developer can actually impact remotely on your game. He can send artifacts to you, he can cast spells on you, he can create new locations within the game that you can visit for only a temporary period, and he often announces these, you know, on the chat. So the ability to kind of get involved and make people feel like there's a kind of wider thing happening, that could be a really powerful force. And the Tome community are a very dedicated community to the game, and I think these social elements help a lot with that. You can have progression. Sorry, I'm going to just need to get some water. Could you throw me that bottle, please? So, progression is the key thing Rogue Legacy does, like I said about having progressed characters and so on. But there's lots of other types of progression that you can have. So unlocks is a key thing. Doom the Roguelike, for instance, it has 5 difficulty settings, but the top 3 are locked. It's not until you win the game that you can unlock the top difficulty settings. And it kind of means that people are encouraged to go towards a difficulty level that maybe suits them better when they're first playing the game, but gives them extra challenge the more they play the game. So if they're very dedicated to the game, they can unlock these extra challenges and get further enjoyment out of the game from these things. There is a danger with any kind of unlock system like that, in fact with a lot of these things, in that if you start playing on a new computer, you probably won't have all your unlock data with you. And that could be really frustrating. especially if you like to play on the highest difficulty, but you've got to scum a bunch of actions on the lower difficulty levels just so you can get back to the way you like to play. It's very annoying. So I usually encourage developers, when they have some sort of unlock system, not to make it too tedious and have workarounds somehow. Don't make it impossible to cheat, because some people will just want to cheat and get all those unlocks. Lots of games now have like certain characters that are locked. For instance, character classes. You can't play a mage until you've done this within the game, things like that. And it can get very onerous when you feel like 75% of the game is locked out from you, even though you've paid for it. So other forms of progression, you can have bonuses towards your character or to the world. I talked about points that get accrued within Rogue Legacy. Dungeon Mans does the same thing. So this is a screenshot of Dungeon Mans. In Dungeon Mans, you build up an academy whilst also playing your character. And every time you play, you get extra points towards your next character. And certain things will advance in the academy, which means that you can get access to new items, new identification of items, various other little ways of adding changes to the world, not just for that character, but for all your future characters. And you even make changes to the world itself. Dungeons that you destroy stay destroyed. So when you're playing the next character, that location is still marked in the same state it was in with the previous character. You can have other kind of legacy mechanics. I talked about the progression of people within Rogue Legacy, that you're not just gaining certain points and things, but you're having a game across games. You're having a way of thinking about how is this character going to affect the next character. And there's a lot of interesting things to play around with there, around progression, around adding things, and making it not just a points meter that goes up each game, but actually making it something that's interactive, that the player engages with. Now, what really interests me is the gameplay side of metagaming. So how you can use this to not just be a way of adding to future runs. I think the Rogue Legacy stuff, for my personal taste, it goes a little bit too far on making it feel like it's not about the character you're playing, it's about what you're doing over numerous runs. It can feel a bit scummy. It can feel like, when you're playing it, you're not actually playing it to win. You're playing a long game instead. And I really like the mastery feel of roguelikes, whereby what you're doing, you always feel like you have a chance of winning with that character. So although I like the idea of changes coming about, what I'm more interested in is changes that aren't necessarily positive or negative. They can be negative towards the character. They're changes to the world that will affect future options without making it feel like you have to die to be able to win. Okay? So corpses and ghosts is one thing I talked about before, whereby you can have the ghosts of previous characters appearing in future games. And they can help you remind you of famous deaths that you had, very memorable deaths that you had, and previous gameplay things. Oh, look, there's my character that got eaten by a dragon. Oh, half his equipment's dissolved off now, but he still has that axe that I really liked. Maybe if I kill him, I'll get that axe I liked again. There's other little things like that. You can have impact on the future procedural generation. So one thing Binding of Isaac does is that as you play, you unlock new items, and they get added to the set of items that can then appear in future runs, which I think is a really interesting mechanic. Some people hate it because they say that there's an optimal point whilst playing where you've got the best item set that can appear. If you play it too much, a lot of junky items get added. If you play it too little, the good items don't get added. It feels a little artificial. Yeah, I don't think it's too bad a deal, but I can understand that point. But you can do other things to have sort of variety in the game. In particular, thinking about, when we generate levels in a game or generate content in a game, we have some sort of random seed value. Now, what about if a specific action feeds in a specific number to that seed? You don't need to know what that content will be. The random seed, you don't really know what it will produce, but being able to draw your seeds from information about previous characters or about how that player has been performing it can make the whole game feel like it's customized to how that player is playing. And each player ends up with their procedural generation system morphing around their play style and their decisions. It's a way of exploiting the way we use numbers in procedural generation with the data that we've got from previous ways in which that character is playing, or that player is playing. And you can make the world change from this. So Ultima Ratio Regum. Ultima Ratio Regum is a really giant game in development by Mark Johnson. And you explore cities and civilizations. It generates a whole history to the world every time you play. It's a really fantastic experiment in procedural generation. Now, Mark is still developing this game, but one of the ideas that he's been playing with is the idea that you can alter history in the game. So you get to a certain point in the game, and you might find a history book about a certain civilization, and you decide that you rewrite that history book. Okay, and that changes. Now, you don't make a specific, well, definitely X is dead and Y is alive. You might go back 500 years and make that change, but the impact on the modern world will be different. There's a kind of butterfly effect. So you're changing things that are happening within the procedural generation, which then regenerates the world in a new state. And then having to deal with the consequences and hoping that it's useful to you. And the more you do this, the more you get used to ways in which you can do this towards your benefit. I think this is a really fantastic idea, the idea that we're playing with the generator itself. So the things that you're doing, you could have a game whereby every new character literally is a new character in that world, where that things change in the world from one run to the next, but the impact of previous characters is still felt there. And again, it goes back to that idea of it's procedurally generating the world around you, not just around some random numbers, but around the actions that you're taking. It's still roguelike in that it's all randomly generated, it's all done anew. You're not keeping over points or items or anything like that, but you are working within a framework that's based around your own actions. You can have multi-game puzzles and boss fights. So you can have a puzzle, for instance, that is only unlocked over 10 runs, because each run you have to do a different part of it, and a little bit more gets completed each time. So after a certain number of runs, you're getting extra rewards. You can have boss fights that because you killed the boss fight this time, next time that guy's not around, you'll face a different person. And there's ways in which you can use this to improve the way people experience roguelikes. One problem with roguelikes is repetition, whereby you're playing a game and you're going through the same levels all the time, you're facing the same enemies all the time. One of the things I did with the Trapped Heart, actually no, I didn't do it, I intended to do it, but it's something I played with in some other games, is that there will be multiple levels that you can advance through, right? So when you go from the forest level onto the next level, you might end up in a castle, you might end up in a dungeon, you might end up in a swamp. Each time you play, it makes sure, so it'll randomly pick one of those three, but each time you play, it checks what you got last time and makes sure you don't get that same one again. So it's taking over the knowledge of what you played last time and making sure you're not repeating the same content each time. So there's still randomness in there, but it's just making sure that it feels more random in a certain way. We have this odd thing that, if you keep rolling a 6-sided dice all the time, you will sometimes end up with strings of ones. But we as humans see that and think that's not very random. So there's a way of introducing artificial randomness by loading the generator, reading what the player has seen before, so that they feel like it's more random and they get better variety and enjoyment out of that. There's also the idea of multi-stage game completion, i.e. a game is not won through a single advancement of a character. And this is something I played with in The Trapped Heart. So in The Trapped Heart, there are two main characters, and you start off playing as one of the characters, and you're trying to rescue the other character who's trapped in like a cave of crystal. When you complete a run of the game, you yourself get trapped in that crystal, and then you switch to the other character. And then for all future runs, you are that character, unless you can get to the end of the game with that character, and then it kind of switches again. And it actually needs a multi-stage set of ways of acting with both characters to be able to actually complete the game properly and free both characters, and then face the proper end boss with both of them. So it's a way of playing with the idea that a roguelike is just a single run, repeat the same thing each time. Instead, it's a single run. The game is still the same run, but you can end up with a different character each time. And to actually get the proper way of winning, you actually need to complete the game multiple times, but using the right actions each time. And there's a lot of experimentation that can be done here. There's a lot more that can be done here. Just using the thoughts of what data is being generated in each run and what you can be changing in the next game using the information that you have. There's lots of other ways of using meta information from outside of the game. Narrative effects, I think, is a really cool thing you can do. So if anyone's played Undertale, it's got a lot of interesting meta effects. One of the things it does, for instance, is one of the fights that you play against, you're kind of expected to die against that fight a lot of the time. And in fact, every time you come across that battle again, you get a new piece of dialogue with that enemy. So the enemy is taunting you for how many times it's killed you as you're playing against it. And you're actually getting a little bit more of the story and the background of that character as it goes on. So more exposition each time you play. And that's interesting. And I think that's definitely something we can play with in roguelikes. In roguelikes, we have this thing that we want to have a story to the game, but you don't want to give all that story in a single run because you'll keep coming across the same content each time. So if instead you have a certain amount of lore or narrative content in the game, but drip feed it across multiple runs so that you're building a picture of what the real narrative is over 20, 30, 100 games rather than getting a wall of text every single time you play. You can have real-world references in games. I don't mean pop culture references. I mean the game looking at reality as you play. So Psycho Mantis in Metal Gear Solid, whilst you're playing on the PlayStation, he will look at your memory card and see what games you've played. And he'll start referencing them. And this is really creepy when you're playing. You suddenly start saying you like Castlevania. Now, if you haven't read the spoilers online and this happens, you'll feel a little bit creeped out. So you've got a question?
Yeah, it happened to me.
Yeah?
I'm a big fan of ideas.
Yeah.
And if you play it on the GameCube, that remake, it reads the Nintendo games. So it goes like, you like Smash Brothers or Smash Bros.
Yeah.
You like Super Mario, this.
Yeah. So it's creepy. The game is telling you the things you've been doing. And with an enemy that, in the theme of the game is meant to be messing with your mind, he literally is. And to defeat this boss in the game, he takes over your character, right? So your character no longer obeys your actions. The way to defeat it is to actually put a controller in the controller 2 slot and play using that. Because the controller 1 slot has been taken over by Psycho Mantis. So it's a really weird metagame thing that it does. For those that have played Undertale, there's a wonderful moment in the game where one of the enemies in the game starts talking as if he's talking directly to you, the player. And he starts saying, you can't use your save slot anymore. It's not going to work like that. I'm in control now. And then it cuts out the game. The game just appears to crash. And it's a very confusing moment, and you come up and it says save file corrupted, unable to load save. And then it then goes through a whole different narrative whereby that person is now controlling your save slot and you're not allowed to save in the game anymore, and it's controlling what point in which you get restored. It's a really weird way of the game interacting with you directly, the player. And there's more things that you could do here. There's another game that looks at the files that are on your computer, and it pretends that there's a hacker enemy in the game and starts telling you it's deleting all these files. And these are all real files on your computer that it's telling you it's deleting. And that is a very panicky thing to happen in a game. There's an encounter that we designed in Tales of Magial where you come across a powerful enemy and suddenly your hit points start draining in real time. This doesn't happen in the game. You never get like a real-time effect, but this suddenly happens in this special encounter. And you get all the game effects of running, being close to death. The screen starts going red, like a panic sound plays. And And I've heard of a lot of players that come across that moment and suddenly feel like they're having a heart attack because this isn't supposed to happen. So there's lots of ways you can think about player psychology and then reach out and look at ways in which you can use the data available to your game. There's also lots of real-world APIs out there. So a couple of conferences ago, we had someone who was using data, online. APIs is a way of accessing data from some sort of online service. Twitter API lets you look at all the tweets that are going on out there. Look at what hashtags are popular, for instance. Turns out that Pornhub has an API, so you can make a game using Pornhub content, like using knowledge of what people are watching right now. And these guys were making a game that was generating boss fights based on the sort of pornography that people were watching right then and there, which is incredibly creepy. But you can do that if you want, And there are lots of other ways of informing what you do with real-world content, going out and seeing what data is available out there and feeding that into your generator and feeding that into your game content. Player tips and tutorials. So one thing, of course, when a player is playing your game, whenever they die, you should have knowledge in your game of how they died. One of the things I did with the Trapped Heart is that I tracked a lot of stats about how people actually played. And in particular, I knew that there's a lot of new mechanics in here that people would be uncomfortable with. For instance, with one of the characters, if you're standing next to a wall, your speed will be reduced within the game. So I started tracking how often people were standing next to walls. And if I found that people were dying, and in their history of their game, they had had a stat that was showing that they were standing next to walls a lot, I would give them a tip when they died, and we'd come up with this kind of death tip system. And it would include a tip saying, you'd spent a lot of time next to walls. Next time, try and improve that. And it looked at a whole bunch of other things to see, what. And if it saw that you were still doing that in future games, it came up with a second reminder with some slightly different text. And then a third time with slightly more exasperated text saying, really, seriously, get away from the walls. They're slowing you down. That's why you're dying. So, you can improve a player's experience by giving them tips and tutorials through the information that you provide them with on death based on what you're observing them doing, by tracking stats of how they play and having some knowledge about your game and about how you can be improving that for them. And there's surely a lot more we can be doing. We think of games in a very closed way, a very if-then-else way of our code being a self-contained thing, of what's happening in the game being entirely constrained to within the rules of the game. We can reach far beyond what is happening in a normal game. And yeah, so I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I will end with XKCD's famous topic about what meta is, because there is an XKCD for everything, including meta. Any questions?
So that thing you said about closed source systems. So I, as a developer, am very fascinated with secrets in games. And you mentioned in one of your slides about closed sourcing the game so that the player can figure out the mechanics through code. Well, I'm interested, is that possible today? Because I know, for example, like games like Dark Souls, that as soon as they hit the market, people data mine them and everything about the game is out in like 2 weeks and stuff. And it would be really awesome if there was a way we could protect that information.
Yeah, so the question there is about can we really have true closed source, that people data mine games and rip them apart, decompile them, etc. And yeah, you're right, there's not really a way of completely closing it. I was just bringing it up as something within the roguelike community. We tend to have open source games. Personally, I am very pro open source. I think it's important to have open source. I think it's very helpful for all of us to have open source. It helps your players find bugs for you. It helps people mod your game, all sorts of different things. we can never have full secrets. I think there's ways of obfuscating code. You can include red herrings in there for people to find. You can make a little metagame there just in terms of what weird things you put in your code. But you can never stop everyone entirely. All I would say is that the vast majority of the players never touch that stuff, and lots of people don't read the spoilers and the wikis and so on. So, in particular, if you have enough information within the game so that people don't feel they need to go outside for advice, if you have the right sort of guidance and tooltips and things like that so that people feel like they have the game information, then they won't feel the need to do that. The other thing is if the theme of your game sufficiently shows that this is supposed to be a mystery, then hopefully people will avoid looking for the answer elsewhere. That doesn't always work. Some people just don't like mysteries. And I think to a certain extent, oh well, live and let live. If that's how they prefer to do things, then let them do so.
How do you feel about the person for me or before that mentioned Dark Souls? Dark Souls and Bloodborne have this system where players can leave messages to other players in the game, and that's really a form of metagame. And I know in roguelikes you have procedural levels, so it's not always feasible, but it's sort of similar to what Bones and Ghosts does. So I guess my question is, do you know of any examples where players are allowed to communicate to other players in this sort of form of metagame? Now, it doesn't have to be text, anything.
So, the question was about people leaving messages for each other in Dark Souls, which is a very cool example of kind of this social metagaming. So in roguelikes, we do have things like the ability, like Tome has a server, so where you can chat to other people. People can ask you questions, you can give them advice. We don't have the same sort of thing of directly commenting on content, and like you say, it doesn't work so easily because, because it is randomized, so you're never sure of having the same situation. And a good roguelike, technically, that should never work. Now, you could have it that a certain seed, for instance, has some comments on it from other players. So Brogue, for instance, could have a shared seed commenting system. Like, oh, look out for that plate mail on level 3. It's really good. That sort of thing. I would feel a little dirty about that myself. It's not something I would use. In fact, I often see comments online of, oh, check out this seed in Brogue. It's really cool. There's X on level 5 and so on. And I'm like, I don't want to know. That's not how I want to play my roguelike. But some people could like that, and that could be something that you could include. You could have something very similar actually using, depending on the procedural generation system used. A lot of games use this kind of stitching of subparts of a level. You have certain groups of rooms in a certain alignment. They get rotated, and they get put in, and there's certain content in there. There's vaults in a lot of roguelikes where the vault is kind of pre-programmed with a certain set of things. You could let players leave messages in vaults or other kind of fixed content like that within the game. So you could use a Dark Souls-esque thing like that. The other thing, of course, is corpses. So the corpses, if they're tied to the location in which they died, then that's a way of kind of transmitting a little bit of information. And you could let players, for instance, have the option of they're going to leave a corpse behind, and they get to leave a little message with it. Or if it's going to leave a ghost, what does the ghost scream at the player as they're charging towards them? That could be a really interesting way of playing with that sort of content. So yeah, I think there's loads that you could do, and it's definitely worth exploring more. No further questions? Great. We'll go on to the next talk. Thank you very much.